and biblical chronology is a big subject. I just want to take a bite of it in this video. I want to focus on the chronology of a single verse in the Bible, and that verse being 1 Kings 6:1. If we can understand how chronology works for 1 Kings 6:1, then we can take that understanding and apply it out to biblical chronology for the rest of the Bible. 1 Kings 6:1 says, "In the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord." So the whole Bible gives us these different measures of time across the whole biblical chronology. A great example of this is 1 Kings 6:1, which gives us a measure of time of 480 years between these two significant events of the Exodus and the building of the temple in Jerusalem. We know what year the temple began to be built in Jerusalem. It was the 4th year of Solomon. We know what month. The problem is we don't know what BC date is the 4th year of King Solomon's reign. The way that they measured time in ancient times is different than the way that we measure it today. So how do we get a BC date for the 4th year of King Solomon's reign? Because if we have one, then all we have to do is add 480 years, and then we'll have a BC date for the Exodus.
So why can we predict eclipses so accurately? Well, first let's talk about what an eclipse actually is. An eclipse occurs when the moon comes between the Earth and the sun and basically casts a shadow on the Earth. Now you can see from the moon orbiting the Earth that this actually happens quite frequently, about once a month. So why don't we get an eclipse every month? Well, from a two-dimensional view, it looks like we should, but we get the answer when we look at the third dimension. You see, the moon's orbit around the Earth is actually at a tilt. That means that the moon not only has to be between the sun and the Earth, but it also has to be at the right place in its orbit height-wise. Otherwise, it's too high or too low to cast a shadow on the Earth. Now, there are a couple more factors if you really want to get into the details, but that's roughly how eclipses work. And because we know pretty much exactly how the moon orbits the Earth and how the Earth orbits the sun, we can predict pretty much down to the second when eclipses will be. Not only can we predict when it'll be, but we can also predict where it'll be on the surface of the Earth.
And just like we can look forward and predict when eclipses are going to be, we can look backwards and tell when they were.
In fact, NASA has a page on their website dedicated to future and past eclipses. And if you go to -762, then you'll see the one that went over Nineveh. The reason it's -762 instead of 763 BC is because they're using astronomical years and we use Gregorian years. But it's the same eclipse.
So because George Smith knew when roughly the eclipse happened, around the 8th century BC, and he knew where it was seen from, Nineveh, he could look back and using astronomical data, pinpoint the exact eclipse that was recorded in that tablet. And that was the eclipse on June 15th, 763 BC. And that is incredibly significant because that gave an absolute date to at least part of Assyrian chronology and ultimately biblical chronology.
So because my son and I were working on this project, we had the NASA catalog of solar eclipses. And this lists out the solar eclipses that are still to come in the future, all the way out to about the year 3000 AD, and the ones that have already happened all the way back in time to about 2000 BC. So I have this catalog, and I remember that I saw a solar eclipse when I was a kid. And so to identify this in the catalog, I needed to know where I saw it from. And I knew that it was from Saudi Arabia. That's where I grew up. My dad worked for the oil company there. And then the general time period, I knew that I had seen it at some point in the 1970s, though I didn't know the exact year, much less the month or the day. And so it was a simple process of going back in this catalog to the 1970s, start looking at the solar eclipses that happened in that decade, and then identifying the solar eclipse that was observable from Saudi Arabia. And I found it easily. I saw that solar eclipse on April 29th, 1976. And so it was an amazing thing for me to find personally in my own life an exact date that I could attach memories to. And this is exactly, I realized, how George Smith did it. Now Smith knew the eponym year mentioning the eclipse of the sun was 763 BC. Because there was a complete list of years, this one known year meant that all the other years could be worked out up and down the chronology. In other words, the one date led to working out all the other dates. In this way, over a span of some 244 years of Assyrian history, every year became known from about 892 through 648 BC. The result was that now the BC dates for the Assyrian chronology were now known. And so the question then was that now that the Assyrian chronology had been worked out with BC dates, was there any way to sync the Assyrian chronology together with the biblical chronology? And in order to do this, you need a shared event between those two histories. Now that Smith knew that the year that the Assyrian king Sennacherib had ascended the throne at Nineveh was 705 BC, he therefore also knew that 4 years later, when the record says Sennacherib led an expedition to Palestine, that this was 701 BC. Now keep in mind that in the 1800s, when Smith was compiling and publishing his material, ancient Judah was known as Palestine. So he translated Sennacherib's expedition to Judah as an expedition to Palestine, so that the readers would know where the text was referring to. 2 Kings 18:13 says, "In the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib king of Assyria attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them." So bam, that was it. The 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign in the Bible is the same year as Sennacherib's 4th year in the Assyrian chronology. So this is the Taylor prism, and this gives Sennacherib's own account of his invasion of the kingdom of Judah. 701 BC transferred over to the biblical chronology, and in the same way it had worked with the Assyrian chronology by knowing the one date, now the other dates for the biblical chronology could be worked out from that one date. Now I should mention that there is more than one shared event between the Assyrian and biblical chronologies. But I am only using one as an example so you can understand how it works. I hope to cover the others in future videos. So all you have to do is take the 14th year of King Hezekiah, his reign 701 BC, and then the Bible gives us how many kings ruled over Judah, how many years they reigned, and so you just count that number of years back to the 4th year of Solomon when he began to build the temple, which was 966 BC. And then all you have to do is add 480 to the 966, and then you have the biblical date of the Exodus in 1446 BC. So up to this point, the generally accepted date for the Exodus was 1491 BC. That was overturned because of this discovery, and the generally accepted date for the Exodus became 1446 BC. Now, you know, James Ussher deserves a lot of credit. I mean, it's pretty amazing that in 1650 AD that he gave a date of the Exodus that was within 50 years of the actual date. Hats off to James Ussher, and but there's a difference between James Ussher's date, which was an estimate, and this new date, which is not an estimate, but it's based off of the exact date known from a solar eclipse and then the numbers that are given in the Bible itself. This is why it's called the Bible of the Exodus.